Like Canada, the United States has a painful history of creating boarding schools to try to reshape and re-educate Native American children. It was a practice that led to trauma, abuse, and deaths. For more than 150 years, Indigenous children were taken from their families and forced into far-away boarding schools. At one point, there were more than 300 such schools, often run by religious groups, some by the federal government. By the 1920s, over 80% of Native American school-age children were in these schools. Those practices ended in the 1960s. But now there is a reckoning, and a new federal investigation's underway. It's being run under the Department of the Interior, and I spoke with Interior Secretary Deb Haaland about this and her personal story. Secretary Haaland, thank you so much for joining us. I have to say at the outset that this is one of the saddest, most disturbing stories I've ever seen. To think of these thousands and thousands of children taken from their families, so many of whom never came back. The families never knew what happened to them. It's unspeakable. And your own family was touched by this.
Yes, it is a tragic era in our history, in American history. The boarding school era. I think about it as sort of one of the last-ditch efforts to get Native Americans out of their communities and put them into mainstream society after, genocide, after the killing off of, vast numbers of Native folks so that folks could take their land. And it was tragic after everything else that had happened as well. And they took Indians from their communities and their families so they could indoctrinate them, right? To take away their clothing, to brutally, take away their languages and their cultures. And many children, yes, they never made it back home. I am grateful that my grandparents made it back home. I wouldn't be here today if they hadn't, of course. And so this is a history that all of us need to know about so that we can begin a healing process for the families who are still living with the generational trauma of the boarding school era, of the assimilation era, of all of the terrible eras of federal Indian policy that tribes have had to live with.
Do you have a good understanding, do you think, of what happened to the children who died?
Well, I mean, we don't know, right? And that is one of the things that we hope to find out with our federal boarding school initiative. It was widely known that in Indian boarding schools that malnutrition was an issue. If you talk to folks whose grandparents went to boarding school and they've heard stories, there's stories about kids jumping off of trains because they didn't want to go to the boarding school, running away and never being seen again. This was, there were many ways, yes, that children died in those settings. And that's one of the things that we're hoping we can find out.
And it was, as you said, a widely accepted policy in this country, in the United States, and in Canada. I read your quote from the Civil War veteran who founded the school for children in Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, who said, and I'm quoting, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." It is astonishing to think that that was the mindset behind this.
Yes, indeed. Native Americans weren't thought of as humans. We weren't considered citizens of this country until 1924. We didn't have the right to vote in many, many communities, some as late as 1960 or 62. We weren't thought of as valuable, contributors to this country. And yet today we see that, Native Americans have the highest rate of military service. The ratio is higher than any other groups of people. We step up to defend our country And of course, today we defied all the odds. Many of our families, our ancestors persevered. My grandparents actually were part of the assimilation era. After boarding school, they went and worked on the railroad in Winslow, Arizona. My grandfather was a diesel train mechanic for 45 years. That's what they wanted to do, was get Native Americans off of their lands, out of their communities. And my grandparents did that, but instead my grandfather protected our traditions, even in a place that wasn't his homeland, so that I could know and learn what it means to be a Pueblo woman. And I'm so grateful that they persevered through all of that history.